Over to you, Stuart.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to Aberdeen Climate Café for inviting me to come and speak. Thanks to you all for coming. I'm going to talk about the global surge in military spending and military carbon emissions. And I've got a few slides, and I'll put them on the SGL website afterwards if you want to read them in more detail or follow up any of the references. So, in case you haven't heard of Scientists for Global Responsibility before, we're a UK organisation, research and advocacy, and we have a membership of about 500 scientists and engineers across the UK and a few internationally. We have a wide range of concerns, but climate change and militarism are two of the biggest ones. We've done a particularly large amount over the last 5 years or so on military greenhouse gas emissions and related issues, so that's what I'm going to talk about mainly tonight. And you can download some of our reports online, but I'll refer to them during the talk. So, okay, first part of the talk, I'm going to talk about the military spending surge. Here's a graph from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute of global military spending since the late 80s, and you can see particularly the growth in the last decade or so. And we reached in 2025 the world reached 2.9 trillion in military spending, which is a record for the time period that we have good data for. It's probably higher than at any time during the Cold War, but we don't have good data for that. It's certainly one of the highest periods of military spending since the Second World War. Um, and things are getting worse. The UN projects that by 2035, so in about 10 years' time, it'll be at least 4.4 trillion and possibly as high as 6.6 trillion. Um, so that's a massive amount on top of what we're already spending, at least a 50% increase and quite possibly more than doubling over the record levels that we already have. So what role does NATO play in this? Well, NATO countries are currently responsible for more than half of military spending, 55%, latest estimate. Spending increases over the last 7 years. Across the 32 member alliance, the increase has been about 34%. If you take out the USA, which is by far the largest spender in NATO, and you look at the increase across Europe and Canada, it's been 74%, absolutely huge spending increase over that period. Um, Spending targets within NATO are given as a fraction of the size of the national economy, measured by gross domestic product. So there wasn't a target of 2% of GDP for military spending only. There is now, since agreement at the NATO summit last year, a new target of 5% of GDP, 3.5% on the military itself, and 1.5% on broader security related measures. So that's a massive increase in spending directed to military and wider security measures. The spending increase just for the military over the 17-year period from 2018 is projected to be at least 130%. So a massive increase, more than double, far more than double. If we look at the UK situation, latest figures for 2024-25 is about £60 billion. That's a 27% rise over the previous 7 years. So compared with the numbers I was showing you for NATO, that's a bit less than average. The reason for that is because military spending in the UK was already high, whereas other countries in Europe particularly had smaller militaries. The UK has always been a large military spender, not quite as big as the US as a fraction of GDP, but nevertheless still high. And then we have the planned rise, including the latest announced spending rises by Keir Starmer. We're looking at something like 22% rise in the next 5 years to the 2030 to the end of this decade to around 73 billion. And all these figures are inflation adjusted figures. So they may be slightly different to what you've seen on news bulletins, for example. Government often talks in um, unadjusted figures, which makes the spending look bigger. Related to the NATO targets, we're approaching 2.6% GDP in the UK by 2027. For military spending, if you include security spending, government estimates will hit 4.1% next year. That's still 0.9%. That's still a large amount of funding to be found between 2027 and 2035. UK military spending is already the highest since World War II, so higher than any period, any time during the Cold War. So again, it's a massive amount of money that we are directing to military spending and related spending. Where's this money coming from? Well, across NATO, it's coming from a range of sources: cuts to foreign aid budgets, welfare budgets, climate budgets. Some of it's coming from tax rises, some of it's coming from increased borrowing, particularly in the EU. A little bit is coming from relabeling existing budgets, so that's basically a way of making the numbers look bigger again. If we look at the UK as an example, I think it's particularly striking the UK situation. In 2020, UK overseas development aid spending was at about 0.7% of gross national income. This is another measure of the size of the economy, bit different to GDP, but not too different. In 2021, Boris Johnson cut that from 0.7% to 0.5%, and then Keir Starmer's cut it to 0.3%, and that cut will take effect in 2027. At the current time, that's equivalent to a total cut of about £13 billion per year. And so that's £13 billion taken away from aid spending, from tackling poverty, from vaccination programs, from climate adaptation programs, and instead spent on weapons spending and other military spending in the UK. So it's a massive, massive shift in social justice spending, really. If we look at the global situation again, this is a graph from the United Nations. They published last year. It compares global military spending over the past decade with what we could have spent that money on to help reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see that measures to tackle poverty or health, vaccination, education, clean energy, it dwarfs the figures necessary. The one most relevant to this talk is the 170 billion total spending needed to provide universal electricity access via renewable energy, and it's a tiny amount of money compared with military spending, and we can't even manage that. It just shows the injustice of this spending without even considering the impacts of war itself. So let's look at military carbon emissions, and I will come back to how military spending relates to this shortly. We'll start off with the military carbon blueprint, the complexity of trying to even define what military emissions are. So this is a diagram of various different components of military emissions. So in the middle there, you've got what we conventionally associate with military emissions: military equipment use, the combat planes, the fossil fuels burnt in combat planes, warships, tanks, etc. But you've also got the fuel burnt at bases, electricity use, then you've got all the supply chains for making the equipment, the aircraft, etc., but also things like uniforms and stuff. On the right-hand side of the diagram, you've got the warfighting impacts. So there's things like the destruction of forests or the destruction of carbon reservoirs, as we saw so graphically in Iran a couple of months ago. You've also got things like the carbon footprint of healthcare, of treating the casualties, and another big one is post-conflict reconstruction of all the buildings destroyed and damaged during war. So how do we try and organize this into some categories that we can try and measure? There are three basic definitions that I want to introduce here, and I'll talk about these during the rest of the talk. The first one is core carbon emissions. So this is what you directly associate with an organization, the direct fuel use, in this case, military vehicles, planes, ships, etc., heating at military bases, electricity use. Then you've got the carbon footprint, which is all the supply chains and logistical chains within an organization. And then a uniquely military to a military concept is carbon blueprint, where you include the impacts of war fighting. And so I'll talk about these. And I just want to say, if I talk about carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions or GHG emissions, I'm talking about the same thing. I will flick between these, I'm afraid. So the first thing to realize is the data here is very poor. The national reporting of direct military GHGs is riddled with all sorts of exemptions and inconsistencies. Different countries report data in different ways. There's different labels used. Sometimes it's not clear that they're military emissions at all. But that's the good data. The worst data is indirect military emissions, where reporting is almost non-existent. There's only a few pieces of data there, a few data sets there. We looked at this in detail in a report we published last year, and we estimated that typically a military will report less than 10% of their military carbon footprint. No data whatsoever on the boot print, the war-related impacts. And this is because data on indirect emissions is so sparse. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the UN's advisory body on climate science, has never published any data in this area. So it's a real problem. And this lack of data has been used to falsely argue that militaries and war emissions are just, well, too small to worry about. No, they're big and they're just labeled differently. We did a study with the Conflict and Environment Observatory in 2022. We estimated that the military carbon footprint is somewhere in the region of 2,750 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's about 5.5% of global emissions. If it were a country, it'd be larger than Russia. You can see in the graph in the corner there where it is between India and Russia. Fourth largest country in the world if it were a country. But of course, as I say, the data is very poor. The uncertainty range is high. We estimated a range of between 3.3% and 7% of global emissions. And importantly, we didn't estimate war impacts because that's even more difficult. So this is conservative in many ways. If we look at war-related impacts, there is some data that's been assembled by some researchers in the Netherlands and Ukraine. And they estimate that the Russia-Ukraine war, which is probably the most carbon-intensive war that is happening at the moment, that's over the past 4 years, it's been about 300 million tons, so a little under 100 million tons a year. And you can see the different categories there, and you can see, for example, the reconstruction is nearly a quarter of it. So those are emissions that are after the conflict ends, whenever that might be. And as I say, these aren't counted within our earlier estimate of the global carbon footprint. The links between military spending and military carbon emissions, well, these are complicated. And I won't go through all of this table, but I'll just give you some examples of the way in which the linkages occur and their complexities. So at the top row, we've got if you spend the extra budget for the military on extra fuel, fossil fuel for military activity, then you obviously get an increase in core carbon emissions from burning fuel in aircraft, warships, tanks, etc. And that's relatively easy to see if there is any data being reported by that military. The problem is, as you move down the table and get to the bottom level of the table, if you have increased numbers and capability of military craft, and that's where most of the new spending is going at the moment in NATO, It's difficult to tell those emissions to see those emissions in various data sets. But there is going to be a big impact on supply chains. On the arms industry, emissions are going to grow. The supply chains supplying the militaries are going to grow. So, but that data is particularly hard to see. That relationship is particularly hard to see. We did a review of research that's been done in this area, looking at the link between military carbon emissions and military spending. And we estimated, based on 11 studies that we looked at, for an increase in military spending of $100 billion, carbon emissions rise by about 32 million tons. And again, there's a wide uncertainty on that. But you can see this is quickly accumulate these rises. Interestingly, we saw for a decrease in military spending of $100 billion, carbon emissions fall actually quicker. And we think this is due to the fact that the inefficient equipment is retired quickly when military spending falls. So actually, cutting military spending is a very effective way of cutting carbon emissions. But unfortunately, countries aren't really thinking about that at the moment. If you look at how these spending increases translate into totals for NATO and the world as a whole, we did some projections for NATO. We estimated that over the next 10 years, that could be equivalent to adding another country the size of Chile to the world economy and to the world's emissions. For the world, extra military spending across the world in 2035, that could be as high as adding another country the size of Brazil. And Brazil is the sixth largest carbon emitter in the world. So these are vast increases that we're looking at. So, okay, so we've got these emissions. How do we reduce them? There are two main options, really. The one is that the one the military prefers is to develop lower carbon weapon systems, and the one that we would advocate is the alternative of less military activity and more peace. And I'll look at these two options in turn. So lower carbon military technologies, this is the only approach considered within military climate strategies. UK Ministry of Defence put it as an aim of their document, and this is quite typical. We will seek to use the green transition to add to military capabilities. Or in another way, we will fight and win in ever more hostile and unforgiving physical environments. The Americans put it more succinctly, and that's the image in the corner there: more fight, less fuel. And that's basically the rationale that they're working with. And the technologies that they're looking to develop or refine is some of the most controversial in the climate sector. So it's things like biofuels, it's things like AI tech, drones, nuclear power, carbon offsets. At the less controversial end, you've got solar panels and building energy efficiency improvements. But that's a rather smaller part of the work. Will these technologies reduce emissions? Well, again, I won't go into the detail of this table, but this looks at some of the obstacles of the different technology types. And I'm going to pick one that's particularly significant at the moment, and that's the issue of drones. And you've got a whole bunch of obstacles as to why this may not reduce carbon emissions. One is higher failure rate, is drones crash more, so you have to build more of them. Data center expansion, so whereas drones are smaller because they don't have a pilot on board and therefore use less fuel, you also end up having greater data processing, and that uses energy in a data center somewhere back in the home country. And also there's the issue is that if drones are cheaper than using crewed aircraft, like fighter planes, Then there's the risk that you have rebound, that you just use more. And this is a common problem in carbon, in climate carbon reduction strategies, is that if you make something cheaper, people tend to use more of it and you end up not saving any emissions. And then you've got all the wider impacts, human rights impacts, as we've seen so graphically in places like Gaza and Iran. So there are serious problems with using these technologies. If we look at military climate strategies in action, are they just greenwash? Well, we asked this question and we published this report just yesterday, so you're getting this straight off the press. We looked at 26 military climate strategies across 26 nations. We'll give you an example here of the UK. It had a headline target of 30% emissions reduction over an 8-year period. On the face of it, that looks reasonable, not too bad a target. But then as you look closely and you see all the loopholes, you start to see, well, actually, this isn't quite as good as it seems. So you've got the first loophole. The target only applies to 42% of the core emissions. So it only applies to military bases. It doesn't apply to military equipment, so planes, ships, tanks, etc. Loophole number two is that it relies heavily on decarbonisation of electricity, which is a civilian action done through decarbonising the grid. So the military doesn't have to do anything to get that benefit. Loophole number three is it includes something called military base optimization. So what the UK is doing at the moment is it's closing some old military bases where the buildings are old, poor quality, going to be demolished, and they're building new ones. But new ones they're building are much more energy efficient. That's good, but they're not counting the carbon footprint. They're not counting the carbon emissions of constructing those buildings, which is very sizable. So that's being missed as well. Loophole number four is that we've only got targets 2025 and they're still negotiating the future targets. And loophole number five is that there's no targets at all for the supply chain emissions or warfighting emissions, and we think this is the larger part of the equation. So are these strategies greenwash? I'll leave you to draw your own conclusion. The alternative is less military activity and more peace. And although it seems hard to argue this at the moment, I've just pointed out all the difficulties with the technological route. Peace doesn't seem so difficult in that light. It is, but yeah, I'm not going to make any bones about it. We are in a difficult situation, but this is all the more reason to try harder with diplomacy, with using the approach, using the bodies that we have, like the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, for resolving international conflict, the importance of establishing and adhering to arms control and disarmament treaties, various strategies that reduce military emissions and the size of militaries, things like non-offensive defense strategies. There are lots of options here, and we need to need to speak up about the benefits of these obvious peace benefits, but they reduce carbon emissions and help us tackle climate change too. Will these reduce emissions? Well, they already have. There is some data from the end of the Cold War which showed that when there was demilitarization after the end of the Cold War, the US Army and the UK military also reduced their carbon emissions quite substantially. We don't have data for the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union countries, but we do think that the emissions reductions were even larger in those cases. And I just want to briefly mention a couple of related issues before I finish. The first one is the way in which militaries help to preserve a consumerist economy, one that is very polluting, one that is very unequal. And you can see in the graph on the right, this is quite a well-known graph now that Oxfam produced called the champagne glass graph. And it shows how the richest 10% of the world are responsible for 50% of the world's carbon emissions. And conversely, the poorest 50% are only responsible for about 10% emissions. And this sort of unequal economic system and pollution generating system can only be preserved by having big militaries. And so there's a lot of indirect emissions arising out of this. And one of the ways in which militaries do this is securing preferential access to fossil fuels. And that's the report on the right that Greenpeace produced as an example of the way the EU does this, for example. The UK is also, US obviously, also very active in that area. The other thing to mention, and particularly bearing in mind we have some CND in the audience, is to point out that there's not only a threat from catastrophic climate warming, there's also a threat from catastrophic climate cooling, better known as nuclear winter. And over the last decade or so, the academic research on the threat from nuclear winter has been updated using the latest climate models. So the original research came out in the 80s. This has all been updated, and it confirms the threat and the scale of the threat, and even a regional nuclear war, so-called India-Pakistan, for example, would be enough to generate so much soot injected into the upper atmosphere from all the buildings burning, cities burning, etc. That would go up into the upper atmosphere above the cloud level, block out the sun for years, and that would quickly lead to major drops in temperature. Plants die, animals die, humans starve, and there'll be a global famine affecting something in the region of 2 billion people. And that's just a regional war. If it were a global nuclear war, it would be far worse. So, sorry to end on that note. But one thing just to finish on about what we can do, what campaigners can do, just a few examples here. The most important thing is to raise awareness of this issue. Hardly anybody is aware of this issue. I think climate campaigners are starting to realize the importance of this issue as climate budgets get cut for military purposes, but it really is key that climate campaigners understand the importance of this issue and raise it with politicians so that we understand that there are direct consequences for climate action related to military spending rises. And the first message is the one: militarism steals funds from climate action, so it's far harder to reduce emissions when the military is spending so much. And the second one is, of course, that militarism fuels the climate crisis through the expanded carbon emissions. So this is another reason to speak out against NATO spending targets. Be very wary of green militarism, and I'm giving you lots of reasons why military climate strategies and claims that the military is doing their bit are really rather false. But I mean, the sad thing about this is it is useful when the military says, "Oh, climate change, national security threat," because it pushes it up the political agenda and makes politicians realize how important it is. Unfortunately, their solution is bigger military to tackle the problems, when actually, no, smaller militaries are the way we tackle the problems. There are so many other ways that we need to use to reduce emissions and adapt to the climate change that's happening. And other key things are about talking about the importance of green jobs and how many jobs there are in the green economy and how this is expanding, and also the importance of promoting divestment from fossil fuels and arms companies, and yeah, think about where your pension is invested. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.